Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In this episode, we do war and politics and the Hebrew kingdom. So we start with success. The early Hebrew kingdom is successful, especially under their two greatest kings, the most famous, David and his son Solomon. So the early conquering kings from the mythological or legendary, I shouldn't say mythological, the legendary like Joshua through David clear out the Canaanite tribes, and the Hebrews become the strongest of the Canaanite tribes in Canaan. They're still kind of squashed, but they dominate the Jordan River Valley and the area between the Jordan and the sea. And David's kingdom, or especially Solomon's kingdom, will be the biggest version of what will become known as Palestine, which is different from the modern. This is the Roman idea of it. The largest extent was this territory called Palestine, which is different than modern Palestine. So we're not using this term in the same way. Well, David creates this kingdom around 1000 BC. And in this kingdom, having defeated the Canaanite tribes, they still have the Philistines, these European barbarian peoples, these axe barbarian tough guys who are part of the Bronze Age collapse, like the Hebrews are, camped out in Gaza. So Gaza is never part of an accepted part of the Israel-Judah kingdom. And then north of them is the land of the Cedars, the rugged land of what we call Lebanon today, what would have been Phoenicia, the land of the Phoenicians, who spoke a variety of I believe it's a Canaanite language, of Phoenician, but they're distant cousins. So when the Bible talks about Canaanites, they never mean the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are tied into trade with both Babylon and Egypt. They're seagoing people. They're sophisticated. They are different than the people of the Jordan River Valley, even if they speak a similar language. They're if they're cousins, they are so distant, like they don't know that they're cousins. But the Hebrews are on a better footing with them because there's never really a kingdom in Phoenicia, a united kingdom that threatens them. Instead, there are city-states that do trade. And so this is kind of how the Middle East worked, the Middle Ages worked. A lot of the trade that the kingdom of Israel will do, which is not much, but a lot of it comes through the Phoenician trade, because otherwise they have this giant desert, the Negev desert to their south, the Sinai desert to the southwest. And so you have these long deserts to try to get to Egypt. And the Phoenicians are already got all the sea, they got the trade. Remember, Jerusalem is not a port. The Hebrews, the Israelites, will have no major port of any significance for trade because they don't want to be jacked into world trade. We talked about that earlier. And so they will rely on a good relationship with the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians don't threaten them because, like I said, they're all divided into these little city-states that survive on trade. So that brings us to David. And David will solidify a kingdom and then build Jerusalem as a capital. Now, why? Why will he build a capital city, a large city that hadn't existed for the first 500 years or 200 to 300 years since the legendary Moses? And the answer is because they want to be considered serious people. And it's not that they didn't want to be considered serious people before. It's that they were fighting before. So they didn't have the money. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the security. Now they have all those things. And now the idea is we are serious. So we live in the Mesopotamian world. We are a Mesopotamian culture. We talked about this in our first lecture. The Israelites, the Hebrews, are Mesopotamian, not Egyptian by culture. And so when they look about how does someone treat us significantly, how does someone know we're serious as a people rather than some loser people, we need to have a Babylon. We need to have a city. Now, is it going to be a natural trade city like Babylon? No, because that's not who the Hebrews are. Is it going to be a military camp like the Romans will build in Germany and Gaul and Brittany, like London will be? No, again, not who the Hebrews are. What Jerusalem's going to be is a religious center. It's going to be the home of the Ark of the Covenant. It is going to be later the source of many significant buildings, which we'll talk about in a moment. But first before we build the significant buildings, we need to have the center. We need to have the city. And so David will build Jerusalem. Now, there's a lot of not historical, legendary reasons involving Bathsheba and God and his relationship with God about why he doesn't complete this city and make it a complete city. We don't need to get into that now, but the point is that the writers at the time, or I shouldn't say that, the writers in 500 BC, 500 years later, had this question too. If David is so cool, and he is, why doesn't he finish the city? Why doesn't he put all the religious stuff in it? He's obviously going to build a religious city. Why doesn't he finish? So they had to come up with a reason. And the reason why they came up with as religious people was a religious answer. God prevented him from doing so. But ultimately the idea was he's using Babylon and the Phoenician cities as models so that when someone from Babylon comes, someone from Phoenicia comes to Jerusalem, they look around and go, yeah, you're serious people. We like you. Rather than the people out in the desert who have nothing. Like those are still barbarians. The Philistines in Gaza. Even the Philistines in Gaza will build Gaza because they want to be treated seriously. And if you or anybody in the Middle East, you have to have a city. And we're going to see this. We've seen this. We see it with the Assyrians. They build Nineveh. We saw it with the Persians. They built Persepolis. Again and again and again, people look at Babylon and they go, we need one of these. Now, none of them work like Babylon. But it was the idea. It's like going to New York and looking around and going, in my city, we need skyscrapers. We have to have them. If you don't have skyscrapers, you're not a real city. Paris gets away with it by having the Eiffel Tower. They got one skyscraper nobody likes on the outskirts of town, and then they have the Eiffel Tower, which everybody sees. And they go, see, we got that. Everything else can be 3 stories, but we got the Eiffel Tower. Do you have an Eiffel Tower? Like, no. But we got skyscrapers. So you get these skyscrapers in Taiwan, in Malaysia, in Abu Dhabi, in Riyadh, in these weird places. And you're like, why do you need a 150-story building? You don't need it. And the idea is, it's not about business. It's about showing off we're real people. London has big buildings. Tokyo has big buildings. Shanghai has big buildings. New York and Chicago have big buildings. We're going to have big buildings too, whether we need them or not. So Jerusalem is built by David to show we're a serious people. It is Solomon who will finish it as a religious city. And it is Solomon who will build the temple. Capital T, capital H, capital E, the temple. Now, that is not the Western Wall that's up today. That is not there. We'll talk about that in a moment when we get to the feet part. The Temple of Solomon does not exist. But what he built was a massive temple complex. And it shows that religion is the most important thing. It was 30% of all the square footage within the walls of Jerusalem. 1 out of every 3 feet was dedicated to the temple. That tells you that by definition, religion is the most important thing in these people's culture. It is going to have the Holy of Holies, where it's God's house on earth. The Holy of Holies is where the Ark of the Covenant will be. It is where God lived on earth. It will have thousands of priests who all need to buy stuff. They need to buy food. They need to buy garments. They need to buy vestments. They need to buy pen and paper. They need to buy lots of stuff, which means the entire economy of Jerusalem is dedicated towards supplying the temple with its goods. You need furniture. Every priest is going to need a room with a desk. They're going to need some blankets, some pillows. They're going to need something to sleep on. So someone's like, oh, I'm going to make the pillows because I know that they're going to spend money. And these guys are going to want to, they're the elite. They know they're the elite. They're in the biggest thing in the city. So they're going to want good pillows, not crappy pillows. And so you get this competition for who can make luxury pillows. And you go, well, that's silly. But everything had to be created for these guys. So they become the economic engine of Jerusalem. So people have to move into the city to make stuff for them, make desks, make furniture, right? But now that guy needs to eat, which means now there needs to be a marketplace to sell food to those guys, the pillow maker, the desk maker, the pen maker. You now need the paper maker. You now need food supply. They will need supplies, like they need pillows and they need blankets, and they have kids, which means you need school teachers, which means, and you see how the economy, the temple becomes the engine of this economy because it's so big. It just sucks in the labor and it sucks in stuff from people and exhales money. So it's a giant public works program. That's what it is. Just like the pyramids are, just like Persepolis was to Darius, it is a thing that brings the Israelites together. That makes a lot of people money. And if you're living in Jerusalem, you're either part of the religious community or you're part of the marketplace selling to the religious elites. So this is how things work. Now, what is going to happen, though, is they will be crushed by the more professional armies that we've talked about: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon. That's what's going to happen. Why? Because they're a medium-ranked power. They just are. I'm sorry. This is the story of the Hebrews in the Middle East at this time. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, later on the Persians, later on the Greeks, and later on the Romans, and later on the Arabs are all going to come through Canaan, Palestine, and conquer it. The Romans are going to depopulate it. And the Assyrians will depopulate half of it. And we'll talk about that in a moment. They are a medium-ranked power. They are a big fish in an ocean of killer whales. And that's a problem. They're a big fish. They're tuna. They're 400, 500 pounds. They're not insignificant at all. The problem is Babylon, the city of Babylon, is as big as all the people living in Israel. Egypt is the biggest, oldest country on earth. If the Pharaoh wants to conquer Canaan, he can conquer Canaan. There's really nothing any king in Jerusalem can do to stop him. They just can't. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the economic power. They don't have the allies. Nobody's going to ally with Canaan against Egypt. It's just not going to happen. And in fact, the Canaanites, the Hebrews know this. The Israelites know this. And so they ally with Egypt to help protect them from Babylon, which works when you're David, when you're Solomon. It doesn't work later on, when the Babylonians and the Egyptians get into a fight and they're going to boom in your territory in the middle. When Nebuchadnezzar gets on the road to go to conquer Egypt, he's got to stop in Palestine, Canaan. And that's bad. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So we have a successful kingdom. We have our first middle-ranked kingdom, and it lasts 500 years, not an insignificant amount of time. The problem with it is it's surrounded by bigger, richer, older, more powerful kingdoms who get into fights with each other. And remember rule 1 of this class that we have talked about since day 1. Rule 1 is don't lose. And the Hebrews are in a terrible position. They're going to lose. So the question is, how do they survive those defeats, those losses, when other civilizations don't? The Assyrians don't. New Kingdom Egypt doesn't. The Persian kings don't. The Persian culture will, but the Persian political system will collapse under Alexander. The Greeks' empires will disappear. How? So that's going to be our next part. So, actually, that's not a bad thing. It's about 15 minutes in. It's a good place to stop. And when we come back in our next episode, we will do the defeat of Israel and Judah and the Hebrew/Jewish, because we're not yet Jewish yet. We're still ancient Hebrews, the Israelites. What their response will be and how they will figure out how to survive as a medium-sized people in a land of much bigger empires. Thank you.